Hey everyone. So we are on page 12 in our notes. We're going to be talking about distance, rate, and time today. So go ahead, take a moment, find page 12 and fill out today's date. And go ahead and fill in today's essential question that we're going to be answering. How do I find distance, rate, and time? Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started on this. So distance, rate, and time. We're going to be using three different variables, one for each of these when we're looking at our equation. So when we look at an equation, you're going to see the variable d, and that stands for distance. You're going to see the variable r, and that is going to stand for the rate. Or sometimes we might think about it as the speed. So when we're talking about distance and time, the rate is typically going to be our speed. So that might be one way you want to think about that rate. And T, what do you think T is going to stand for? Time. T is going to stand for time in these equations. We are going to have three different equations. We're going to have an equation for when we want to find distance. We're going to have an equation for when the problem wants you to find the rate or the speed. And we're going to have an equation for when you want to find time. So here they are. Our first equation is for distance. When we want to know what d is, when the question says what is the distance, we are going to be taking that rate or the speed and we're going to be multiplying it by the time. So if somebody was driving 30 miles an hour for 2 hours, we would multiply 30 times 2 because that rate is the per hour, and we're going to multiply it by how many hours, and that will give us the total distance traveled. Our second equation that we may be working with is when we want to find our rate, and you have already been finding rate. We found it a long time ago when we looked at unit rates, and we took our distance and we divided it by time. So when we want to know what the rate or the speed is, we're going to take distance and we're going to divide it by time. If we drove 250 miles in 5 hours, what was the speed? We would just divide the 250 by 5. The last equation that we're going to work with is for time. When we have time, when we want to find the time, we're going to take that distance and divide it by the rate. So if I drove 120 miles at 40 miles per hour, if I divide that 120 into 40 groups, I would get how many hours we drove for. So these are our three equations. I'm going to kind of put some fun boxes around them. So when a question is asking for distance, we're using this equation here. When a question is asking for the rate, we're going to take a look at that equation right there. And when a problem is asking for time, we're going to use this equation right here. So when you're looking at a word problem, you want to identify first, what am I trying to find? Then you can pull up your equation and plug in the other information. This pyramid is a way to remember distance, rate, and time. So you may not like the pyramid, and that is okay. The pyramid looks like this, D, R, and T. When we are looking for distance, it is rate times time. When we are looking for the rate, it is distance divided by time. And if we were looking for what time is, it is distance divided, kind of like a fraction there, by the rate. So this pyramid is just kind of a way that you can remember what it is we are working with. You can even put the X right here if you want for the multiplication sign. This is just to help you remember the equations. You might like it, you might just like referring to the equations over here. Either way works. Alrighty, let's take a look at this first example problem here. We're going to fill in some blanks as we read. Those of you working without the outline, you may need to pause here and write down the problem. Mr. York decided to ride his bike to work. It took him 2 hours. His house is 28 miles from work. How fast did he ride his bike? So we have our 3 variables. I like to just start by listing them out. D, R, T. So what do we know? We know that it took him 2 hours. That's our time. So I'm going to fill in that variable. We know that the distance is 28 miles. Miles is a distance. So 28 miles is the D. How fast? We don't know the rate. This is what we are trying to find. So this is how I start each problem. I like to identify my variables. This tells me I'm looking for rate. I need to come up here and look for my equation. Rate is distance divided by time. So now I can just replace my variables with what they are. So that means my distance is 28 and my time is 2. So that means I have 28 divided by 2. What is 28 divided by 2? It is 14. That means my rate, or my speed, is 14. And we need to label it because it's a word problem. And in this case, it is miles per hour. That's all we need to do. Identify the variables, plug it into the equation, do the math, do the multiplication or the division. Let's try one more example problem here. Usain Bolt sprinted 1,500 feet in 5 seconds. How many feet did he sprint in 1 second? Or what is his speed? So those of you needing to write down the problem, take this moment to do that. Let's get started. Let's identify distance, rate, time. The distance for this one says that he sprinted 1,500 feet. That would be our distance. I'm going to shorten that to be FT for feet. In 5 seconds. What is 5 seconds? Is it the rate or the time? It's the time, 5 seconds. So again, in this example problem, I am looking for the rate. That's my answer that I'm looking for. So we can use that same equation up above here. R is equal to D over T. That means my rate is going to be equal to my distance, which I identified as 1,500 feet, over my time, 5 seconds. Now your turn to do a little bit of work here. What is 1,500 divided by 5? 1,500 divided by 5. I think of 15 divided by 5 gives me 3. And then I've got 2 zeros after. It is 300. 300 what? What are we measuring in? His speed is 300 what? Feet per second. We want to make sure we write it out. 300 feet per second. And we got that because of feet right here and seconds right there. So when you are looking for distance, rate, and time, you are identifying each of the 3 variables. What information do you have in your problem? Pick the equation that is going to help you solve for what you are looking for, and solve.